what you see today within this battle of anti-Semitism on American college campuses, an environment of intimidation and hostility. What makes the Western liberal democratic institution like a university any different than a madrasa or university in Tehran, for that matter?
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. In the past year, controversies over whether critical race theory and associated leftist ideologies were being imposed on public schools throughout the country have been something of a dialogue of the deaf. On the one hand, concerned parents worried about a trend in which educators have adopted radical ideas about America and the world. They spoke of how teachers, administrators, and school boards were allowing notions about America being an irredeemably racist nation, or supporting intersectional notions about the need to support the struggles of all people of color against allegedly oppressive beneficiaries of white privilege. Those behind these efforts, as well as some of their mainstream liberal apologists, claim that this is all fiction, and that no such efforts were being undertaken in the schools. Yet as evidence piled up of how ideas about race, in which students were divided and lectured about the evils of white privilege, as opposed to learning the facts about the country's racist past and struggles to overcome it, and the need for equity rather than equality, it was clear that they were gaslighting the nation. However, a new lawsuit about ethnic studies in Los Angeles illustrates not only how radicals are trying to use the public education system to impose their toxic theories on school children, but the deceptive manner they are using to do it. It also shows that the Jewish stakes in the battle over CRT are much higher than many people understand. The background to the case, in which the public interest law firm, the Deborah Project, has sued the liberated ethnic studies model curriculum et al. On behalf of the concerned Jewish parents and teachers of Los Angeles, involves a fight that most of the organized Jewish community thought they had already won. In the spring of 2021, a long-running controversy over the content of California's proposed ethnic studies curriculum in the spring of 2021 ended with the Jewish community satisfied. The first draft of a proposed curriculum had erased the Jews as a group worth recognizing, as well as included anti-Israel and anti-Semitic content. A battle in the legislature and a veto by Governor Gavin Newsom spiked that proposal and resulted in a new framework for the subject that would supposedly ensure that courses taught the subject in public schools would be free of anti-Jewish bias, as well as radical leftist critiques of Zionism and other politicized material. The approved curriculum included lessons on Jews, the Mizrahi experience, and anti-Semitism, with study of the latter rooted in the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's widely approved working definition. But as I wrote at the time, confidence that the state's decision ended the controversy was misplaced. The question remained, how would the curriculum would be implemented in the state school districts, and how school boards and teachers would interpret the guidelines. Moreover, there was reason to believe that the entire idea of interjecting ideas about ethnicity was being pushed by educators with a political agenda rooted in the same toxic ideas that animated the curriculum that California had rejected. Those who were behind the drive to install ethnic studies courses in schools were dedicated to using public education, have CRT and intersectionality ideology go mainstream. That meant that it was more than likely the approved curriculum would be manipulated by extremists to do exactly what Newsom and the California legislature had thought they had stopped. As Deborah Project legal director Lori Lowenthal Marcus has written, what's been going on is that a group of promoting something they call the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum have, with the help of the Teachers Union in Los Angeles, been working covertly to have courses taught in the schools conform to a worldview in which leftist ideas about the need to resist empire, white supremacy, racism, patriarchy, cis-heteropatriarchy, capitalism, ableism, and anthropocentrism have become the focus of education in California. As JNS has also reported, this effort centers on having ethnic studies only touch on Black, Latino, Native Americans, and Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. The latter group has been interpreted to include people from the Middle East, but pointedly excludes Jews. It sets aside the long history of oppression, religious hatred, and ethnic cleansing carried out against Jews because, according to the CRT worldview, Jews are white and therefore privileged oppressors. What happened was that a number of radicals behind the liberated curriculum have, with the help of the United Teachers of Los Angeles, sought to bypass rules about transparency and public accountability and impose their own CRT-inspired agenda on ethnic studies courses. As Marcus discovered during the course of her investigation, the liberated curriculum group advised teachers to fly under the radar and hide their goals, methods, and details about their course material, and confide them only to those administrators, teachers, and parents who are ready to back their transformation of the schools into bases for leftist activism. This would be deeply troubling under any circumstances, since, like so many other efforts to use the schools to mainstream these toxic theories, such as curricula based on the New York Times' fallacious 1619 Project, their ultimate purpose is to instill hatred for America and to place race at the center of every discussion. This is antithetical to the notion, put forward by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that promoting equality and judging people by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin is the goal Americans should strive toward. Many liberal Jews have felt free to support the Black Lives Matter movement after the death of George Floyd in 2020. They regarded the way CRT and intersectionality labeled Israel and Jews as possessors of white privilege and belonging to the oppressor class as a peripheral issue, even if it did grant a permission slip for anti-Semitism. The Deborah Project's lawsuit demonstrated that hatred for Israel and contempt for Jews, even for liberal groups like the Anti-Defamation League, Jewish federations, and community relations councils, is integral to the campaign for liberated ethnic studies. Its advocates regard demonizing Israel as a priority and think of Jews who are even minimally supportive of the Jewish state's right to exist as supporters of white supremacy whose influence must be eradicated. That these ideas are inherently illiberal is obvious, but becomes even more explicit when supporters of liberated ethnic studies in teachers' unions and elsewhere in the educational establishment say they are opposed to multiculturalism. They aren't actually interested in diversity, which means celebrating the broad mosaic of American ethnic groups from all backgrounds. What they want is a curriculum that is solely focused on an anti-democratic narrative in which certain groups deemed to be victims must be advanced, while everyone else is deemed a privileged oppressor who must be penalized. The bottom line of liberated courses is that Israel has no right to exist, and that Zionism is racism. That is justified by putting forward the lie that Zionism and love of the land of Israel is not an essential part of Judaism. This denies to the Jewish people rights not denied to any other group. It is textbook anti-Semitism. That radical groups supported by the LA Teachers Union are doing this is a disgrace. But it is also, as the Deborah Project's lawsuit shows, a violation of federal and state laws that prohibit such blatant discrimination. The wheels of justice grind slowly, and the vagaries of the court system mean that there is no guarantee that this lawsuit will succeed in holding these law-breaking radicals behind this effort accountable. But by exposing their scheme, the case strips the veil of respectability away from those promoting this agenda. There is no longer any room for doubt about the way that extremists are trying to hijack our public education system, not only to trash traditional values of patriotism and liberalism, but to mainstream anti-Semitism. If they aren't stopped, it will do more than just hurt Americans' belief in their country and its democratic system. It will also legitimize Jew hatred in a way that has never happened before on American soil. And now to our interview of the week. If there is anything we should have learned by now, it is that toxic trends that begin on college campuses don't stay there. They migrate to the public square, and that's exactly what happened with woke ideologies like critical race theory and intersectionality. If we are having a much-needed debate about the way leftist activists are trying to indoctrinate children with this radical ideology, it is only because they first conquered American institutions of higher learning. Integral to that was the way that happened in the way particular disciplines were first infiltrated and then essentially taken over by leftist ideologues. That's happened in a variety of subjects in traditional courses of study, ranging from English literature to history. But among those that are most vulnerable to this phenomena have been relatively new topics of study. While departments devoted to gender or ethnic studies were obvious candidates for leftist hijacking, the same was true for departments devoted to the study of the Middle East. Indeed, it is clear that the domination of Middle East studies by leftists was an important way for the radicals to establish not just beachheads from which they could mainstream far-left theories, but to make the academy a bastion of hatred and ultimately strongholds of anti-Semitism. It is from these departments and their supporters that the anti-Semitic BDS movement has not just gained a hearing, but become a formidable force in first academic life and now a factor in American politics. To explain to us today how this happened, we're fortunate to have with us someone who has devoted his career to unraveling the bias against Israel in the academy and the way the study of the Middle East and Israel has become dominated by those who have subordinated the truth to ideology. Asaf Romirowsky is the Executive Director of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East and the Association for the Study of the Middle East in Africa. Romirowsky is also a Senior Non-Resident Research Fellow at the Bacon Sadat Center for Strategic Studies and a professor at the University of Haifa. Trained as a Middle East historian, he holds a PhD in Middle East and Mediterranean Studies from King's College London and has published widely on various aspects of the Arab-Israeli conflict and American foreign policy in the Middle East, as well as on Israeli and Zionist history. Asaf Romirowsky, welcome to Top Story.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, Asaf, we're really thrilled to have you today. Scholars for Peace in the Middle East has been in the forefront of the fight against anti-Semitism in the academy, especially the struggle against BDS. While BDS has suffered more setbacks probably than it has achieved victories, a recent development showed how strong the animus for Israel and the abandonment of scholarly objectivity in the field of Middle East studies is. Can you tell us about what recently happened with the Middle East Studies Association with regard to BDS and why it matters?
Sure. Well, again, it's great to be here, and I know it's good to be amongst friends. So, as you mentioned, SPME has been around for the past 20 years on the forefront of combating BDS. Of late, SPME also joined forces with the Association of Middle East Studies in Africa, with the acronym known as ASMIA. ASMIA was created actually to counter MESA, the group that we're talking about, Middle East Studies.
Middle East Studies Association
of America. And ASMIA was founded by the two late Middle East giants, Fuad Ajami and Bernard Lewis, about 15 years ago. What has happened of late and recently, at the end of November, end of December, really, a referendum was passed of the entire membership of the Middle East Studies Association, asking their membership to vote on the idea of supporting BDS. This is the groundwork for this was actually set back, laid back in 2017 when they changed their bylaws. They moved on from becoming a non-political entity association, supposedly dealing with scholarship, and becoming a politicized group, which is what they are now. I would argue that they're no different these days from JVP or any other group for that matter. By
JVP, you mean Jewish Voices for Peace, an anti-Zionist and I would argue anti-Semitic organization.
I would agree with that assessment. And so they are actually now an advocacy organization. So they sent the referendum out. It passed at the end, really at the end of towards the end of March, and no surprise to those of us who've been watching and observing Mesa, they indeed um, voted to endorse the boycott movement. And that was what has happened of late. We have argued, my colleagues and I at ASMEA, that this is really validates what all of us have argued, a degradation of the academy. Really, the vote really encapsulates, to my mind, everything wrong with the academy as far as censorship, boycotting. Middle East studies really represents the pinnacle of many of the problems that we see today in the humanities. BDS, I would argue, in its totality, is a halo for the Arab-Israeli conflict at large and the study of Middle East studies. And here you have individuals who claim to be experts on the Middle East, and what they are doing is boycotting an entire segment of the Middle East. And though they will say that they kind of what I would call a soft peddling of the environment, that their boycott is against the institutions, not the individuals. That's a lot of hogwash to my mind. When you talk about individuals who represent their institutions, nobody differentiates between the individuals and the institutions. And so that is what has happened. And now we are dealing with the consequences of all of that. And I would say that, interestingly enough, what's happening now, positively, Mesa has had institutional members, and many of those members are now not renewing or canceling their institutional membership as a result of Mesa supporting BDS, particularly on a political level. Those domestic institutions who are in state who have anti-BDS legislation.
Now, when you say some MESA members of the Middle East Studies Association are leaving, can you give us some examples?
So there were Brandeis is one of the few that made like a big splash about not renewing its membership and is left. There have been a bunch, in the Midwest that are not renewing. You might remember that the Florida universities, after Governor DeSantis made his comment, made a huge stink about the fact that they will not allow state schools to join a group that is openly supporting BDS. Arizona did the same thing. Interestingly, about Arizona, the home base of Mesa used to be Arizona. They actually moved their headquarters from Arizona to Washington, D.C. No surprise there. They're currently now located at GW. There's
George
a whole
Washington University.
Correct. And so these are the institutions who are making.
Have all the Florida state institutions, have they all left, or is that just in process yet?
They're in process. Those who have been members of Mesa have not renewed, and so they've made a clear move about that. And there's still conversations taking place. We have not seen en masse. I think there's been more of an education to what this actually means. My argument, and many of my colleagues have argued, that even for balance sake, if you're going to be a member of Mesa, it's important that you should also be a member of ASMEA. Though I think that, again, it's very clear that, supporting the idea of boycott, to my mind, is antithetical towards the whole concept of what the academy should be about, as far as the exchange of ideas. We have not seen many, but some are indeed joining our ranks. We are non-political, and we accept all forms of discussion and intellectual conversations that should be a free exchange of open ideas. That's clearly not what Mesa is putting out there.
Mm-hmm. Now, to the layman who is not involved with the academy, doesn't know the various, sort of institutional loyalties, sure. I guess the question is, it's not really just a question of like which club, faculties are joining.
Correct.
This is a greatly symbolic. This is an issue which is about both symbolism and it has practical applications too, because if your Middle East Studies department formally supports BDS, what exactly are you teaching there at that university or college, right?
Exactly. It's more than that. I mean, it's the fact that this really represents the what I would call the Palestinianization of the academy and the politicization of the academy. The fact that really, going back to my earlier remarks, the fact that they're an advocacy organization, to my mind, it connotes propaganda, of course. So the question are the people who are in teaching these classes in the academy, not only are they encouraging their students to endorse boycott, and they do in their classrooms, but they're also giving a skewed view of the Middle East at large. The Middle East, as both of us know, is a rich, complex environment full of theology, politics, and culture, and they have become hyper-focused and sensitive on the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic, and only by using the code words that you've spoken about and have written about before within the environment of council culture are only teaching about this small myopic perspective of the issue, which only gives a limited viewpoint and a lens of the reality of the Middle East. And so these students are basically being indoctrinated to follow this school of thought. I would also say over the years that individuals who are in doctoral programs have been encouraged by advisors to follow this path, which also gives no room for topics that they may not find applicable or acceptable in these classrooms by these individuals.
Now, let's go a little deeper into the weeds about what happened to Middle East studies. You mentioned before two of the great scholars of the subject, Fuad Ajami and Bernard Lewis. They founded the Middle East Studies Association. People whose work was groundbreaking and opened up the topic, certainly to many Americans, many students. What happened to Middle East studies to get from, Fuad Ajami and Bernard Lewis to the current BDS crowd? How did an entire, faculty, an entire discipline be taken over in this manner?
Right. So just to be clear, Ajami and Lewis founded the Association of Middle East Studies in Africa, not MESA. So
Right.
They founded ASMIA 15 years ago. And
Right.
part of the reason that they founded ASMIA, because they saw the writing on the wall as far as what is happening within the hallways and the realm of Middle East studies at large. To your point, I would say that there have been many factors that have played out here. If you go back to the 1960s, you've seen a growth of Arab money that has been poured into American institutions, the influence of the late Palestinian advocate scholar Edward Said, who had a famous debate with Bernard Lewis at Mesa, by the way, where you really saw the hijacking of the academy at large. The individuals who are now on the forefront of BDS and of MESA are the same kind of BDS advocates, individuals like Stephen Saleda and Jaz Barpour and other kind of waving the flag, hyper energetic, pro BDSers who are going around trying to advocate and really inflame the entire association. Scholarship is harder and harder to come by within Middle East studies. Anybody, and by the way, I would also note that MESA has had over the years many members who are Israeli members, but to get today to be, and the Israeli Academy tends to lean left, like in the United States, but not as far progressive left as you see in the American Academy and in American progressive leftist circles today at large. They're basically walking around with a target on their back these days. One of the signs of that, when they declared their call for BDS, the Association of Israel Studies, which was an affiliate member of MESA, decided to disaffiliate its membership. So you've seen a growth of political activism and propaganda that has basically filled every aspect and every tentacle of Middle East studies at large. And the individuals who have been, many of them, I've written about, you've written about, Jonathan, people at Columbia like Rashid Khalidi, Hamid Dabashi, Joseph Massad, have all been card-carrying members of the Middle East Studies Association of America. I haven't gone to Mesa in many years, but I remember as a graduate student going, back in the day, the politicization and the kind of hypersensitive pro-Palestinianism, you could see it everywhere. But you can't. But there were at least some amount of a little bit of balance. Mesa is the same organization that after 9/11 mocked the study of terrorism. Their presidential speech at the time, the president of Mesa was no other than Joe Biden of Stanford at the time, who gave his famous speech about studying, terrorology and mocking those of us who were looking into Islamist terrorism. So there are topics that have been taboo within the circles of Mesa. Again, replacing scholarship and only studying based on their view of the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic. Again, putting aside an entire region at large without, what's going around and without focusing on that. So the combination of the money, the individuals, Arab money, and again, on the point of Arab money, the idea behind funding chairs and departments that have come out of Arab money, even ties with terrorist money. The connotation was very clear that you also buy the politics of the department that you're buying. And so the expectation is that when you are investing this kind of money, you're also going to get a clear return based on the kind of information. I wouldn't even say scholarship, but the kind of propaganda and information that they perceive that should be taught in these departments.
You mentioned Edward Said. He wasn't actually a Middle East scholar. He was he was somebody who, far from it. But he was actually someone who studied English literature. Why is Said so important? Why did he help to sort of revolutionize the study of the Middle East in a way that was certainly very negative and caused a lot of damage?
Sure. So going back to that, the debate that Said and Lewis had, part of the debate was about Said's famous work entitled Orientalism. And the book was published in 1978. The gist of the book, for your listeners to understand, is that basically that those who are not from the Orient, referring to the Middle East, do not understand the Orient, thus they cannot teach or study about the Orient, and he was referring only to the Arab population who actually knows, and they are fully Orientalists. Lewis did a phenomenal critique of the book called Islam in the West, which anybody who studies these, the Middle East, even these days, should read Lewis's critique of Said's work. And if you're going to study, you should study both books in tandem. That is not the case. But the Said influence, if you really survey departments, not only even in Middle East studies, but in the humanities at large. And to your point exactly, Said was a professor of English Lit at Columbia. He was not a Middle East scholar. People are still reading Orientalism, and that's how they're getting their understanding or myopic understanding of the Middle East. And so the influence that Said had, and Said, to his credit, was a prolific writer and a phenomenal orator, and he would mobilize crowds. Any one of these activists today, scholars all wants to be an Edward Said in the way that they were able to galvanize the crowd, and he was able to really give an intellectual conversation while weaving in the propaganda at the same time, which was part of his charm and his intellect.
He was actually a member of the Palestinian National Assembly.
He was
a critic of Arafat for even the tentative fake efforts towards peace.
Right.
And also someone who had the kind of intellectual health, the kind of superstar. He became friends with Daniel Barenbaum, the famous Israeli conductor. Really opened up new fronts against Israel in ways that the anti-Israel movement had never before done.
Correct, and that's where the kind of the cultural phenomenon of the anti-Western, anti-Israeli culture played into it, and he and Birnbaum would go and play together. I mean, this was not something, and he knew how to do it very well in a very seamless way, showing again through art and culture and music, of course, really where that venom played into the conversation. That was his appeal. And you are right to point out that he was a critic of Arafat, but he also got everything wrong when it came to the Palestinian Authority. He had all these predictions about democratization and when they're going to democratize and when it's going to happen. None of that, of course, ever came to fruition. Again, for his lack of understanding of Middle East history, again, as an English lit, he mostly spoke from his own opinions, not necessarily bearing, grounded in any kind of historical fact. But that was Said, and that was his charm. And as I mentioned, the next generation is not as intellectually savvy or qualified. But then again, today, you're talking about a generation of individuals who uses social media to get their message out there. Said didn't have that. All you need is 160 characters and maybe a meme or an Instagram to talk about justice and human rights and whatnot, and then your message is sold. And so, again, part of the degradation of the academy at large, I would argue, is that people are expected to understand or unpack an entire swatch of history in 160 characters. So they know nothing, and really they have none of the depth or the richness required to really understand the Middle East of today. Not to mention the fact, taking it one step forward. The impact of the Abraham Accords have made not one iota of a difference within the halls of the academy at all. I mean, the focus still is about BDS. And the number one, really, just to point out about BDS, one of the main demands of BDS is anti-normalization. So here, when you have actual normalization with Arab countries, with the state of Israel, clearly it makes no impact whatsoever at all. Actually, they try to shove it under the carpet, argue, anti-Trump rhetoric, whatever needs to happen in order to sell the narrative.
Yeah, let's kind of get into the weeds a little bit more about how this actually operates insofar as classrooms and influence. I mean, one of the phenomena that we're aware of now is that bad things that start on campuses migrate to the public square. That's certainly true with BDS, with critical race theory intersectionality. But what does it mean for college students to have teachers and their professors who have formally endorsed BDS? How does that impact the academic experience? How does that impact the students?
Well, it impacts them greatly. We have seen over the past few years where professors will not even do their basic job as a professor. For example, they won't write letters of recommendations for students to go study abroad in Israel. We saw a major case at that University of Michigan. Anything that touches the topic, again, I started to touch on that earlier on, but if you're looking to study a topic as a graduate student or as a PhD student, or even as an undergrad to get your undergrad thesis, dealing with a topic, let's say, for example, of Islamist theology, and the individual does not support that kind of understanding that there is such a thing, they will shut it down. The topic of even conversations about the Arab-Israeli conflict, or the fact that, the topic of Zionism, the mere word Zionism, the connotation on American college campuses, and by and large, I would say within the circles that you spoke about vis-a-vis critical race theory and intersectionality, Zionism literally means racism. And the idea that today the conversation and a debate about race in America has been parachuted onto the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic in particular. So Jews are white, Palestinians are black, and above all, Jews are racist. And so when you talk about examples like the deadly exchange that we saw happen at Tufts, where people are basically arguing, the Palestinian groups, SJP in particular, Students for Justice in Palestine, that Israel is exporting its racist policies onto American armed services and the police departments, and that's where the brutality is coming from. That's the linkage that's being played out here. And so to say that a professor should be an honest observer and give their students all the information they need in order to come to their own conclusions, I can point, on maybe two hands, maybe today, maybe even less, about individuals that I still know who are teaching these topics, who represent and are doing the job of a professor. It's extremely, you're coming in today knowing you're coming into a environment that is toxic, that is indoctrinating, and really they're not fulfilling their jobs. And so students are leaving there with a very skewed view. The best example that you could see, maybe pointing out to what happened of late with the Crimson at Harvard, what it does do is give you a lens into the American elite of today and the fact that they believe that this is what they should do as a means of justice.
Yeah,
Has not,
just to interject, that you're referring to an editorial that was published in the Harvard Crimson, the student newspaper at Harvard, which formally endorsed BDS. In something that was considered really kind of groundbreaking triumph for the BDS group, because they were basically saying we are at war with Israel, and that this is the voice of the students at sort of the number one elite institution in this country.
correct, 100%. And so the environment that has become religion, and this is religiosity within the humanities in particular, and the idea that what drives a lot of these students on the ground is pursuit of so-called justice and fighting inequalities. Racism represents only one thing, and Jewish students in particular, are challenged by proving two things: one, that Jews are minorities, and B, that anti-Semitism is racism, and no necessarily order of importance. On both accounts, we've had a very difficult time making those cases, and even more so these days. And so that is exactly is also what's happening within the professorate. I mean, faculty are facing the same kind of challenges, and students are. So it's not only a top down, but it's also a bottom up movement that is using both sides of the academy to come out and to ensure the fact that students are coming out with this kind of ingrained stamp understanding of the Middle East, which is, I would say, disingenuous, ahistorical, and really, and it's blatant lies and propaganda that really is playing out into this conversation, which is non-existent. And the academy itself, which should be a place where you could have a free discourse and exchange of ideas, is not happening. Under cancel culture today, if you don't like what is being said, the events are being shut down, canceled forever.
Yeah, I think what you're describing is an atmosphere in which anti-Semitism, targeting Jewish students, forcing them to conform, is becoming really widespread. And it's much greater than the focus of whether particular student bodies or universities are themselves endorsing BDS now, because in many, many cases, universities have rejected the pressure to adopt BDS for their own investments. And the BDS movement has not won that many votes, but their influence goes beyond that. And in fact, whether they win votes or not, they've created an atmosphere on campus where it's very difficult, especially within academic disciplines where the Middle East and Israel comes up, to be a supporter of Israel, even of its right to existence, never mind its policies, right?
100%. I mean, this is exactly the environment that we are facing today. And you're right to point out whether they win or lose in a student senate is irrelevant. If they win, it's a victory. If they lose, it's motivation for the following year. And you see that time and time again. It is correct that the administration, especially presidents, understand the need to have the larger kind of political and diplomatic ties and exchange of academic ties with Israeli institutions. But within the faculty and within the student bodies, this is where these wars are taking place. And they are alive and well, and they dictate the environment on campuses. The critical race theory concept and the intersectionality drives the narrative. And the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic is the quintessential example of that. And so this is where you see this play into classes, into topics that don't have nothing to do with the Middle East, but they use that as perfect examples of how things should be done. So you are creating, and what you see today within this battle of anti-Semitism on American college campuses, an environment of intimidation and hostility, where Jewish students and Jewish faculty are facing great amount of challenges in order to prove what is happening and to even maintain their positions in some of these places.
Yeah, I think that's quite right, and it just becomes a case where you have to sort of go along to get along to go along,
Right.
and if you don't conform or if you aren't silent, you do get canceled. You do find it very hard. Certainly, the dynamic of academia is that if you're someone who doesn't have tenure, seeking it in a Middle East Studies department, you cannot be an open opponent of BDS. I mean, that just isn't happening, right?
100%. I mean, you have to keep your head down, and you have to keep moving along. And even tenure is not guaranteed. I mean, we always say and again, a lot of our members are indeed tenure. Where I'm seeing problems, again, going forward is that we, as part of our work with the Association of Middle East Studies, we help encouraging PhD candidates getting through the process, getting through the tenure process, helping them get published, having them, present their work. But it's hard because first of all, many of the people who are still in the academy are of that ilk who are pro BDS, and they are still sitting on many of these committees. There are much more pro BDS graduate students and PhD candidates in the pipeline who are coming through than there are on our side. And so the trajectory that I'm looking at now, while you could say today in North America, there is still a limited amount of balance. If you look 20 years down the road at the way we're going now, there'll be none. And then what makes the Western liberal democratic institution like a university any different than a madrasa or university in Tehran, for that matter? I mean, this is something we need to think about. These are considered to be, this is a use of soft power. These are agents of influence. This is exactly where you use the academy to move along. And interestingly enough, I would say as a stat, Jews and Catholics are the two largest populations in the history of America who've invested in the academy, where the same institutions are now turning on them as a result of who they are, which I find to be, of course, concerning and really, I think, to epitomizes a lot of the problems we're facing today.
Yeah, and as I pointed out before, you could say, well, this is just craziness on college campuses. What do you expect? But craziness on college campuses doesn't stay on college campuses.
Never.
Yeah, it always migrates. But before we get into sort of the spread of this, I want to ask one more question about the academy. Now, one of the things we saw in the last generation was the growth of Israel studies as almost a separate discipline, as opposed to general Middle East studies.
Mm.
But Israel studies hasn't been immune from this same phenomenon, has it?
No, not at all. Actually, ironically, one of my colleagues, used to say, tongue in cheek, that the Association of Israel Studies is the only association where its members hate the name of its own existence.
Mm-hmm.
But there have been, all joking aside, there have been some positives in the Association of Israel Studies. My friend and colleague Donna Devine, when she was president, was able to make a lot of strides. So was Ilan Troen. You might remember, Jonathan, that we published under Donna's leadership. Word Crimes, which was a publication, the journal of the Association of Israel Studies, which we dealt with the vernacular and the phraseology within Israel Studies, and the backlash was unbelievable. To kind of, just to give you a sense of how enraged the association was that we had the audacity to publish this kind of journal, under their journal, this kind of publication with this theme in it. And all we tried to do was to tag on to the phrases that have hijacked the Arab-Israeli conflict. We were called warmongers, pro-Netanyahu spokesman, and every kind of thing, every kind of name in the book that you could think of to characterize us. And the individuals who contributed to that journal were people on the left and the right, but we were just categorized in that rubric. So while Israel studies, there is a growth. You are seeing people more studying the topic, but it doesn't mean that they're pro-Israel. I mean, they're actually,
or even neutral about Israel.
Correct. I mean, actually, the understanding is, and when there is even a debate on campuses, most people that I debate, if there is discourse, start off by saying, "I'm Jewish, but," or "I had a bar mitzvah," or "I was circumcised."
Or speaking as a Jew, I am against everything Israel does. That's the classic phrase, right?
Correct. I mean, and I've written a great deal also about the phenomenon of Quaker Jews. I mean, so there's another kind of phenomenon that we see here in our hometown in Pennsylvania. But there is, and there's actually a higher percentage of BDS activism in the Quaker schools, given Quaker history. But that's the kind of environment that you're facing, and so there's no guarantee that that if you're Jewish, you support the idea, and they're actually Jewish anti-Semites. If you kind of look at the larger environment and the kind of messaging that they're putting out there.
Okay, I think you've laid out very, very well the challenge. I guess the question we have to ask ourselves is, how can this be reversed if the academy, in a sense, has been captured by not merely BDS advocates, but by people whose whole existence as scholars is dedicated to demonizing Israel, demonizing Zionism, falsely calling it racism, putting it in the context of this whole critical race theory, intersectionality worldview. Is the study of the Middle East, reparable? Is this a discipline that can be saved, or is it just doomed to go on and get worse?
Right. Well, I try to be an optimist, and so I wouldn't be doing what I do if I didn't think that these institutions are worth saving. Asmia, again, is part. I think is a positive alternative to Mesa, and actually we are seeing a growth of people who are joining us membership-wise, and I think that's a positive sign. Our next conference is scheduled to be this coming November under the sub-theme of the State of Middle East Studies post the Mesa vote. And so I think that people who are concerned about scholarship and want to actually have intellectual and have real discourse are welcome. And so we are seeing people who are coming not only from the United States but also from the Middle East. And my hope is that even we're working on creating more ties with the Gulf. To get more to talk about what's happening and actually in the Gulf. We're seeing a lot of Turkish expats who are joining us. And Israelis, of course, are all coming because they are looking for those kind of exchanges and what conferences should be about. So I think that is a positive light there, in order to create balance in the academy. I think that we should continue to, the fight is worth fighting for, because again, if you look at, again, the number one, the number one fundraising and the number one contribution by, if you talk about American Jews, is still their alma mater. They still believe that, I should be giving to the institution that I got the education, my grandparents, etc. And so I think that, it's worth making these cases and making sure that they are, that they're being fought correctly. I also think that there is positively as well that the growth of the adaptation of the IRA definition as far as what anti-Semitism actually is, which IRA includes in it forms of anti-Zionism and anti-Israelism, is indeed positive to hold these institutions accountable. And if you're going to fight racism truly, then that anti-Semitism is racism. And so if these institutions are to remain clean and fighting them, it means fighting all forms of racism. And so that's what we need to be holding their feet to the fire to make sure that actually these things are actually happening. So I see those as positives. It's an uphill battle, but it is to my mind worth the fight.
No, I agree. It is worth the fight. So here's a question: as much as you're not the online college advisor, but for students who are looking to get into the field of Middle East studies, who are not already, sort of captured by the hard left,
Right.
are there places they should be thinking about avoiding more than others? Places that are sort of strongholds of free thinking and of honesty about the subject? Or is the problem just pervasive? Where do you come down on this?
Well, look, I don't think there's an institution today that is immune to any of this. There are levels. And the same way, when I get asked that question a lot, the same way that nobody would buy a car or a house without an inspection, you got to Google everything. I mean, and things are fluid. And the problem is that there are no cookie cutter models. Every campus is politically, culturally different. You could say that there are histories of campuses, that have a long history of pro-Palestinian activism and anti-Semitism, like a Columbia up here in the East Coast, and in a Berkeley on the West Coast. And by the way, to your question, there is no correlation between the amount of Jews on campus and the amount of anti-Semitism. Actually, you see that even in campuses where there are many Jews, you still see a huge rise in anti-Semitism, and so it varies. And you see levels of this. I think that, in the California system, if you're following some of the debate that happened now with the ethnic studies challenge, you can see it being extremely pervasive. And it's always been, more of a hotbed of activism within the UC system at large. But no school is immune to any of this. And I think that we need to provide our students, first of all, they should not go in with their blinders on. They should be aware of what the environment's going in. And frankly, the same kind of biases that you see today are trickling into high school. So we have to prepare and do a much better job before they get to campuses. It cannot be that they get to their freshman year and this is the first time they've heard of these topics. And so preparing and teaching about the topic, we have a rich and wonderful history. It's not perfect. But warts and all, they need to know the history and be taught it again and again, so they know and be able to actually have a serious conversation on the topic and not be swayed by memes and emotions. Another thing that's driving today, of course, is identity politics, and people are entitled to their own opinions. But facts still matter in my mind. And they need to be able to make a convincing argument and talk about the issues, and to see and appreciate the region. There's no, clearly, it is clearly important to go and see in person and visit. Those kind of emotional and physical ties mean a lot, and they need to see it all. And not just be swayed by slogans and propaganda about justice and social justice in order to jump on the bandwagon without knowing exactly what's going on in the region.
Well, that's a great segue to my next question, which is to reference a survey that was just published last week by the Pew Research Institute about attitudes towards Israel, the Palestinians, and specifically about BDS. And this was one of their questions brought a result that was kind of a shocker, I think, to a lot of people who are deeply involved in these issues. And it showed that of Americans who were polled, 84% had no idea, one way or the other, what the debate about BDS was. I mean, that they knew basically nothing or very little about the subject. And when asked, are you for or against BDS? I think the results were something like 6%, yeah, I'm against it. 5%, yeah, I'm for it. Basically, nobody knew what it was talking about. Now, on the one hand, that shows that sort of the BDS movement has not gone mainstream as much as perhaps some of them might think, but it also shows that within sort of the numbers who know about it, it's by no means a slam dunk, despite the fact that Israel is very popular among Americans. Of those who know about BDS, a lot of them are for it. And it shows how dangerous this ideology is, where it does spread.
Oh, 100%. I mean, look, I think at the the Pew report is quite telling. I think, but it also means that we have our work cut out for us because they, again, not knowing is a good sign. Some were saying in the middle that means that they could still be educated, and so I think that there is a silver lining into actually what needs to happen. And at some point, and again, I think it's quite telling about what people know about BDS, and then they're shocked by it, and then they're immediately, oh, that's a good idea, without actually knowing what it actually means. So we definitely have our work cut out for us, and I think that the younger we start, the better off we are. And I think it doesn't only contain to the students themselves; it contains to the families they come from. Whatever mostly happens starts around the dinner table, and I think that people need to be educated all around. And to be aware of what where they're going, where they're sending their kids to school, the influences. I mean, the same kind of cultural phenomenon that you saw with Jews joining groups like the Women's March or Black Lives Matter, not knowing the nefarious goals of these movements, but they're sticking and clinging to the idea that Jews and civil rights, and not fully understanding and grasping the intent of these movements.
Yeah, that leads directly to my next question, because I think a lot of people, certainly within the Jewish community, but elsewhere as well, view these battles that we're seeing, on news, on cable news or elsewhere about critical race theory or intersectionality, and whether it's being whether there is indoctrination going on in the schools, or if it's a fiction, as some people on the left claim, I think disingenuously. This relates directly to Jewish interests, doesn't it?
100%.
Because wherever critical race theory is promulgated, and this is something that migrated from the campus, it legitimizes and grants a permission slip for anti-Semitism, because once you're into critical race theory, you view, Israel and Jews as possessors of white privilege, to be opposed, to be penalized, and it allows the Palestinians to pose as victims.
Yes.
And disregards the fact that, among other things, that that the majority of Israeli Jews are people of color because they trace their origins to the Middle East or North Africa. But this is a very Jewish issue. It's not isolated from the question of anti-Semitism. It's a key to it, isn't it?
100%. I mean, again, as you pointed out correctly, whatever starts on campus never ends on campus. This is a cultural war that you're dealing with, in a war of ideas that we're trying to win the hearts and minds. But I think that the American Jewish community, in particular, as a group, tends to lean left, and even more so, you're seeing the growth of the progressive left, and they see these values, the kind of moral equivocation that Judaism is liberalism, or liberalism means X, Y, and Z as far as Judaism. So as far as the history of Jewish voting and how that again doesn't necessarily correlate with those ideas, but I think that there's still this hardcore belief that Judaism is liberalism, and liberalism also means tikkun olam. And so they misuse the terminology, and they abuse it. And so the question of are these real Jewish values? I mean, and in the process, what has happened, which I think is concerning and frightening, is the fact that Jews are willing to really sacrifice their own Jewishness and what Judaism is about in favor of these so-called Jewish values, and supporting BDS, as you said, the debates about, as a Jew, I'm doing X, Y, and Z, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that you find that very, clear within the value system that, we put out there, Jews who support women's rights and civil rights movements and whatnot. What's interestingly enough is that if you claim openly to be Zionist, then all your other credentials are considered to be null and void. You cannot be a, pro women's rights and pro, gay rights and whatnot, because you are a Zionist. And we have a million examples of that. We saw it with Scarlett Johansson. We saw it with Linda Sarsour in the Women's March. I mean, and so with Jewish women who wanted to come and support those values, if they claimed openly to be Zionists, then they are no longer welcome in those circles, which also speaks to their progressivism and their openness, because it's not really there.
Yeah, I think the point to make here is that, we can have a debate whether Judaism is liberalism and liberalism, is Judaism. But the point is, critical race theory and all the underlying the foundation for BDS is fundamentally illiberal. It is at odds with traditional liberal ideas about open society and being against racism rather than putting race at the center of every conversation, trying to inject it wrongly into the question of the very complex question of who's in the right in the Middle East and Israel's right to exist. This is, and why it's so important to fight it in the academy, because the academy, which was, most academic institutions which are founded to promote a liberal small L view of the world and promote open exchanges and free discourse. This is an end to open exchanges and free discourse. This is about, putting in place ideas which effectively ends tolerance for Jews and codifies anti-Semitism.
100%. I mean, and you see it a lot, to the point that you were raising before, within the cultural wars, when you see it within athletes who are sending out anti-Semitic tweets, and artists who are trying to play in Israel or being boycotted. I mean, one of the number one voices pro BDS is no other than Roger Waters, a former lead singer of Pink Floyd. And so, every time a group, decides to go play in Israel, there's a barrage of attacks on social media trying to prevent them, calling for, social justice and how you don't know about discrimination and what Israel is doing to the poor Palestinians and whatever other kind of skewed viewpoint they have of the region. And so because these individuals are not in the weeds, and going back to the Pew Report as far as the lack of knowledge, they are driven by these images and by critical race theory. And that's what the culture is engendering, rather than going and learning and seeing and to actually getting a real understanding of the issue. And I think that's what we're seeing. A lot of this has to do with ignorance and a clear lack of understanding. And if you're asking, things that need to be done, our number one job should be education. And I think that's where we need to do a much better job all around. I mean, within, the Black African American communities, there's a lack of knowledge when it comes to who Martin Luther King was, MLK's relationship with the state of Israel. I mean, these are basic things that we used to talk about as far as, Jews and the civil rights movement. That's not part of the conversation. And I think that, there's a lot that we need to be doing here in order to increase the level of knowledge to actually have a free exchange of ideas and an actual exchange of ideas.
Yeah, I think that's quite right. And Asaf, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us today. You've given us a lot to think about what's going on in the academy and why it's something to be concerned about. We also want to thank our audience, whether you're listening to us on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, or on JBS TV. Please like and or subscribe to Top Story, give us good reviews, and please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen and watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.